Welcome to the Renewable Energy World Conference and Expo video regarding emissions control regulations and opportunity for renewables. I'm Lindsay Morris, Associate Editor for Power Engineering Magazine and contributing editor for Renewable Energy World North America. Due to a host of emissions control regulations being enacted by the EPA, it is expected that some of the coal-fired generation in the U.S. will retire by the year 2030. As a result, other types of generation will have unforeseen opportunity in the electric generation sector. Renewable generation is expected to account for 17% of total generation by 2030, a recent study by ICF International reports. Today, I'm joined with Rakesh Radhakrishnan. He's an Associate Director of Energy for Navigant Consulting, and Dennis Loria, who is the President of Loria Emerging Consulting. And we're going to talk about this growing opportunity for renewable energy. So let's get started. My first question is, what could the role of such a large percentage of coal-fired generation retiring have for renewables?
I'll take that. To start out, I think as you see the retiring coal fleets, one of the immediate opportunities from a renewable energy perspective is really for biomass. Biomass can certainly be co-fired with existing coal-fired facilities to meet some of those emission standards. And then some of the smaller facilities that are due for retirement that we are hearing from some of our utility clients is that they're actively looking at potentially using biomass as the source for those plants moving forward. So I think that is an interesting kind of development in the industry. And then, of course, we're going to speak about this a little bit later, but natural gas clearly is going to have a major role as these changes start happening as the bridge fuel, and also to deal with some of the intermittency with some of the other renewable energy resources.
Great. Dennis?
I certainly agree. I would just add that in general, coal-fired plants are base-loaded plants. Many of the renewable energy technologies are intermittent resources. So we do need the bridge fuel, natural gas, to serve both baseload and be able to operate more flexibly and be able to better integrate with renewables.
Okay, so opportunity for biomass and natural gas being a bridge fuel. Let's say your company or utility decides to evolve part of their generation from coal to a renewable. What are some of the obstacles that they might run into in that process?
The first thing is, I think, if you're looking at replacing base-loaded capacity, you need a base-load renewable technology primarily, if you're looking at solely renewables. And so you have biomass, you have geothermal, hydro, certainly we don't want to forget about hydro as well. Those facilities tend to be smaller facilities than large base-loaded base-loaded coal plants, so you need many more of those facilities. They tend to be distributed, and because you can't put them all in one location because they're resource limited. And so there may be a requirement to change the distribution and transmission system in order to accommodate more distributed energy resources.
So picking up on that need for extra transmission, I think that's something that a lot of the utilities are actively looking at. If you look at the integrated resource plan that a lot of the utilities are putting out there, you gradually see more and more of them actually factoring in extra transmission, extra renewables in those plans, because those do go out to 2030 and sometimes beyond. I think the key challenge for the utilities, especially when they are in a regulated environment, is how are they going to recover their costs? How is it going to be passed down to the consumer? And that tends to be a big challenge. So that ratepayer impact and making sure that ratepayer impact is minimized is going to be, I think, a big challenge moving forward.
Very good insights. Dennis, you mentioned natural gas earlier. Let's talk about the role that natural gas could play in bridging the transition from so much coal-fired to renewables.
I think it's important to first look at the generation mix. Coal-fired plants are generally used, if not all exclusively used, as base-loaded generation. And so we need something to provide and replace that base-load generation. Nuclear can do that. I think nuclear has a number of challenges over the long term. Right now, particularly with low natural gas and an adequate supply of natural gas in the United States, natural gas is sort of a natural replacement for that baseload capacity. And as I mentioned before, It also has more operating flexibility. It can be used as a base-loaded resource as well as an intermediate resource and ramp up and ramp down to better match the intermittent nature of a lot of renewable resources like solar and wind.
Rakesh?
And as Dennis was mentioning, in terms of natural gas, there are definitely the combined cycles, which are the larger size plants. But then you also have, some of the spinning reserves that are less efficient, but could be potentially dispatched if there were specific yearly requirements that the utility needed to meet as they were moving towards a target by 2030.
Okay, very good. As we all know, there are a number of technologies that coal-fired units are installing, SCR scrubbers. What could these technologies, what kind of impact could they have on a utility's decision to move to a renewable? Because they're so expensive and a lot of times companies can't afford to install them on an older plant, what kind of impact could that have on renewable energy?
In terms of a lot of the pollution control equipment, again, the technology isn't standing still. I mean, people are continuously looking at how do you improve the environmental footprint from a lot of the conventional fossil fuel and coal-generated facilities. I think the key challenge tends to be how much capital cost that adds to the overall mix. But then again, that needs to be traded off against the capital cost requirements for a completely brand new greenfield site. And so if it's an incremental capital cost that can buy you some time as you put in other renewables in the mix, I think that's certainly something that needs to be considered long term. And then on the clean coal front, there's still active research going on. There's talks about CO2 sequestration, of course, with those technologies. That's going to add additional capital costs, but those options need to be explored as the companies are looking at the most efficient way of deploying capital.
If I could add, I would say that they create a challenge for the power industry in general because they will drive up costs. Driving up costs, however, from the renewable energy standpoint, sort of creates an opportunity because the challenge for renewables is always that it needs to be competitive with conventional sources of power. Certainly taking into consideration the environmental benefits and other benefits of security with renewables, but it has to be competitive, and a higher priced conventional generation allows renewables to be more competitive.
Okay, very good. Okay, finally, let's talk about what is the overall benefit if a utility or a company decides to switch from coal-fired generation to a renewable. Why is that beneficial?
Well, clearly there's greenhouse gas benefits for reduced coal generation, but I think a bigger benefit is price stability. Renewable energy, which is capital intensive, and very low operating cost, very low fuel cost, if any fuel cost, can offer very stable prices and predictable prices. Whereas coal, even though coal prices are low today, we don't know where the coal prices are going to be in the future, particularly as increased demand for electricity worldwide. And also that coal has high operating costs, high labor costs, and that can tend to drive up costs and make costs of coal-fired generation uncertain. So I would just add that I think price stability is very important for every electric customer, residential, commercial, and industrial.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dennis. I mean, I think the fact that renewable resources do rely on fuel that is quote-unquote free to some extent is an important feature and an important hedge for the utilities moving forward. Certainly then it's also a hedge in terms of making sure that they are compliant with any future envisioned emission standards that might come out there, right? That certainly provides a lot of uncertainty for them, and so moving forward in front of the issue, I think, is a good way to hedge against any future constraints that might occur. Then more importantly, I think ultimately you do need to see the revenue train. So you need to see that these things can produce revenue for the customer, for the utility, and be beneficial for the customer. And when the utilities can see that this is a viable business, I think that's when they start moving into it. And the revenue streams can come from multiple different sources, not just selling the power, but also any kind of renewable energy certificates that they could potentially sell, say, across the border to another state or to another facility that's non-compliant if emissions actually get controlled and monetized in some way, then that's another revenue stream. So these are kind of the considerations that many of the utilities are looking at moving forward.
Very good. Well, it seems like coal-fired generation retirements could cause some opportunity for renewable energy growth. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dennis Loria and Rakesh Radhakrishnan.
Thank you.
Thank you.